I'm delighted this afternoon to be able to introduce Joni Kinsey to you. When we talked to Leah first about this idea of the symposium, Joni was the first name that she said, oh, we really must have her here to talk about this subject. Joni teaches in the School of Art History for the University of Iowa. And I think this subject in particular will be really exciting today in challenging that idea of Iowa as an area where maybe there wasn't a lot of art or modernism happening, and maybe rethinking some of those ideas. So please give a warm welcome to Joni Kinsey.
Thank you so much. Let me just set my folder down. I'm delighted to be here for this wonderful exhibition. I know it's been a long time in the works, and many of us have been waiting for years for this book and this show. As I just told Leah, I really would like to thank her particularly for her expert work on this, as well as the staff here for making the arrangements for my visit, and it's always nice to travel across the state. I also especially appreciate being here at Iowa State, where the history of Iowa art is celebrated, which isn't so much the case at the University of Iowa, for reasons that I will try to explain today, or at least the origins of that. But certainly we're all indebted to people who appreciate our shared culture, and this exhibition and symposium are a real testament to that. I've been asked today to speak about modernism during Iowa's first 100 years. As we look at the exhibition, that topic might seem a little surprising, since almost none of the images in the show, all carefully and expertly chosen by the leading authority on the subject, have much in the way of strong abstract visual form that most people associate with modernism. Even most of the works from the first half of the 20th century, which was the formative period for modern art in America, have clearly recognizable subject matter and quite traditional styles and colors, rather than the fractured or flattened forms and subjective spatial and coloristic effects that we especially expect to see in modern art. As a result, these objects in the walls and gallery here could lead us to believe that Iowa was not especially relevant to the world of modern art in its first 100 years, or vice versa, that modern art was not especially relevant to Iowa. But upon thoughtful consideration, many of the images in this exhibition reveal that their artists were quite aware of important modernist theories and innovations, and perhaps more importantly, these works, their histories and connections, can tell us a great deal about modernism in the region, including how Iowa played a central role in the formation of modern art in the United States. And I mean that absolutely, a central role. Modern art came most dramatically to America through one event, the so-called Armory Show that opened in New York in 1913 before traveling to Boston and Chicago. It was an enormous exhibition. It got its name because it was so big, they had to rent the National Guard Armory in New York City. It had over 1,500 works in it, which is absolutely enormous. It was an exhibition that shocked most viewers with its vivid styles, particularly ones we know today as Fauvism, Cubism, and Expressionism. Its artists were dramatically upending convention, form, and content of visual expression, and as Mabel Dodge rightly predicted to her friend Georgia O'Keeffe, things will never be quite the same afterwards. But even though large crowds flocked to see the Armory Show in the Midwest and Chicago, its radical art was slow to catch on in Iowa and beyond. Well into the 1920s and 30s, many artists continued working here with more traditional subjects and styles, such as Impressionism, although some, such as this early Marvin Cohn painting reveals, it's just around the corner, they were beginning to respond to the impact of abstraction and move away from literal representation. Others maintained their reliance on subject matter, but began to employ new formal strategies in ways similar to those used by artists we regard as canonical modernists. Harold Palmer Allison's church spire, for example, also here, displays a remarkable sense of abstract form, especially in the flattened color of the tree on the left and the cubist-like interplay of geometric forms in the foreground. In another example, J. Sigmund's crouching feline maintains its recognizability as a cat, but it does so with modernist curves, simplified forms, and smooth surfaces reminiscent of Ely Nodelman's early 20th century modernist work. It's even more comparable to the sculpture of John Youngbear in this exhibition, or the Cherokee modernist Willard Stone, whose sinuous forms revolutionized the genre of wood carving as a contemporary art form. Chris Glassell's lithograph entitled Ironing from 1938 has a different sort of modernistic effect with its strong contrast and broad strokes and its unvarnished glimpse into the lives of 20th century working class women. All were preoccupations of avant-garde predecessors such as John Sloan. In another mode, Dorothea Tomlinson's Threshing at first looks quite conventional with its highly detailed portrayal of a pastoral Iowa farm, but the pronounced patterning of the wagon tracks and the distant crop lines has a distinctly abstract quality, and the broad strokes of pigment in the central mound are more obviously paint in a modern mode than they are rendered straw. Even more progressive, although we take it for granted now, is the picture's heightened point of view, a position that was becoming a modern fact of life in the 1930s as airplane travel made such vantages increasingly routine. Angled views looking down across panoramic farmland not only provided the distance that rendered the terrain more abstract, but they were a new form of vision that began to alter how people thought about land and their relation to it. Here is that Arthur Rothstein photograph I mentioned this morning. As Jason Weems has explained in his book called Barnstorming the Prairies, How Aerial Vision Shaped the Midwest, this is a quote, "This new perspective from above enabled Americans to conceptualize the region as something other than isolated and unchanging, and to see it instead as a dynamic space where people worked to harmonize the core traditions of America's agrarian character with the more abstract forms of 20th century modernity." This last observation, that artists used modernist aesthetics to situate the region at the intersection of tradition and innovation, and I think they would like to add, as central to American identity, lies at the heart of what we call regionalism. It was a movement in art, literature, and music that rose to prominence in the 1930s and was most visibly championed by Iowa's Grant Wood. Regionalism, which is not limited to the Midwest, had shifting reputations in its heyday, first regarded as modernist in comparison with traditional styles and subjects, and then criticized by others as anti-modern, an isolationist and nostalgic art out of step with the progressive avant-garde trends of the era. Today, with the benefit of hindsight, we are increasingly understanding that regionalism was a distinctive strain of modernism that grew out of an earlier movement known as localism. Both localism and regionalism argued that rather than looking to imported subjects and styles for models, the only art authentic to modern times in the United States must be based on a deep understanding of place, history, and culture developed into new forms. As explained by Robert Henry, the so-called father of the Ashcan school in early 20th century New York, and William Carlos Williams, whose Imagist poems are regarded as foundational to modernist writing, novel representations of American identity that were based on lived experience were both timely and important. Thus, when Grant Wood presented Iowa farmland from above as a verdant rolling quilt, and we could apply this comment to most of his distinctive views of Iowa and its inhabitants, he was not only emphasizing the landform's abstract design, but also testifying to his subject's significance for modern times. He also understood, as Henry did in his statement, that the act of interpreting those subjects was vital for contemporary America, and he worked tirelessly throughout his career to engage others in the process of cultural analysis and expression. We see the results of that engagement in many of the works in this exhibition. The artists who participated in the Stone City Art Colony in the early 1930s, a communal art-making workshop that focused on the Iowa landscape, is a case in point. Offering courses accredited through Coe College and taught by Wood and several of his friends, including Marvin Cohn, the colony attracted participants from all over the Midwest, as well as such notable visitors as John Stewart Curry, the Kansas painter whose work would come to stand with Wood's and their Missouri colleague Thomas Hart Benton's as the preeminent representations of regionalism. Although the Stone City Colony only lasted 2 summers in 1932 and 33, it demonstrated the viability of regional imagery and contributed significantly to Iowa's art. 15 of the dozens that participated in the colony are included in this exhibition here today, and many of them went on to exhibit widely, become art teachers, founders of municipal art associations, museum directors, and mural painters. Marvin Cohn, for example, who had been Grant Wood's friend since high school and was a formative influence on his development, went on to have a long career as a painter and a professor at Coe College in Cedar Rapids. John Bloom of Dewitt painted throughout his life, creating several Iowa murals and working as an industrial designer and a commercial artist for the Army Corps of Engineers at the Rock Island Arsenal. Daniel Rhoads had a long and distinguished career in both Iowa and elsewhere, doing a series of federally sponsored murals during the Depression era and going on to become an internationally renowned ceramicist and professor of ceramics at San Francisco Art Institute, Stanford University, and Alfred University in New York. Many other artists who attended the Stone City Colony had similarly rich careers, many of which are explored in detail in the object labels in this exhibition and in the excellent book by Leah Rossin DeLong. Another opportunity for collaborative art making in Iowa emerged almost immediately after the conclusion of the Stone City program, as the federal government, now led by the new president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, inaugurated a host of programs to address the economic depression of the 1930s, and several of these employed artists. The first was the Public Works of Art Project, and Iowa's Grant Wood was appointed its state director in late 1933, the state of Iowa's director. Wood was already nationally famous by that time, especially for his iconic American Gothic of 1930, but his friendship with the assistant director of the PWAP in Washington also helped secure the appointment for him. Edward Rowan had directed the Little Gallery in Cedar Rapids it was called the Little Gallery, in the late 1920s. He had taught at the Stone City Art Colony, and he had been with Wood in Eldon, Iowa, when the artists spied the house that gave American Gothic its name. Both men were enthusiastic about the possibilities for art that would be produced in the federal program, with Rowan writing that he hoped they would make the country proud and help sell the American people that the idea of art should be integral to our part of civilization. Wood hired 43 artists for the PWAP program in Iowa, 9 of whom had been at the Stone City Art Colony, and they set to work on a number of projects, most notably the library murals here at Iowa State University, and Christian Peterson's History of Dairying sculptures, also here, as well as murals for schools and libraries in Des Moines and Sioux City. The Iowa State murals were actually painted in Iowa City on canvas and then moved to Ames upon completion, where they were attached to the library walls. The University of Iowa administrators had become aware of the project early in the process in late 1933, and they invited Wood to conduct the work on the Iowa City campus, offering him a lectureship in the art department, giving course credit to the federal employees for their work, and providing an unused swimming pool for the studio. You can see the tile, if you look carefully, along the walls. They've built a false floor, and see the ladders coming down. The project progressed quickly, and the murals were well received, both locally and when they were shown in Washington in the spring of 1934. The University of Iowa newspaper, the Daily Iowan, noted with pride that the images had been praised by Edwin Alden Jewell in the New York Times as contributing to what it called a new art consciousness that was proving to be a revelation to America. At the same time, at home, anxiety was growing about what some called the liberal trends in Grant Wood's art and the work he was directing. The PWAP artist's public statement that asserted, "We have copied too long, let us now create. Let us use what we know, what we see, what we feel. This is the material for a modern culture," did not reassure those who were unsettled by their work's departure from long-standing artistic traditions with its flattened colors, stylized forms, and the elevation of farmers and laborers to the status of mythological heroes. I also think it's interesting that I've seen this quote in two forms. One was in a letter that Grant Wood wrote to Edward Rowan, and it was identical, except it said, "This is the material for a native culture." This is the final version that was published in the newspaper, and it's interesting to speculate how that change came about. I think the artists themselves that were working with Grant Wood may have influenced that change. They wanted to be more modern. In this casting of Grant Wood as a modernist, a liberal, he was described in the press as a rebel, a radical, and the leader of a new Iowa art school. Some faculty members at the University of Iowa in the art department were so upset by this and what Grant Wood and his students represented that they placed a document in the cornerstone of the new art building describing a campus conflict between the conservatives and the liberals, and they named Grant Wood the leader of the latter. The full details of this document are still unknown, waiting until the cornerstone of that building is open to reveal the exact nature of these tensions. And I have petitioned everybody at the University of Iowa to get this done, including the president. Thinking of Grant Wood and his regionalist imagery as radically modern might be a bit startling to us today, considering that a great deal of mid-century American art was much more unconventional. If nothing else, the shifting controversies demonstrate that the definition of modernism was very much in flux at the time. In a period of economic crisis and political upheaval in America and across the world, many things seemed at stake, including how national values and identity were portrayed. Although the PWAP program was short-lived, it was quickly replaced with several other federal projects for artists, and many Iowans contributed to these, sometimes through works that combine regionalist subject matter with varying degrees of modernistic form. John Bloom, for example, created post office murals in his hometown of Dewitt and in Tipton, Iowa, using a flattened style that abstracted the farm scenes to some degree, as we can see in the drawings. Not only the finished work, but the drawings are in this exhibition. Lee Allen emphasized modern methods of land stewardship in murals for Ottawa and Emmitsburg in scenes that have shifting perspectives and stylized coloration, as does Chris Glassel's mural for Leon, Iowa. Christian Peterson's sculptures have an innate abstract patterning that gives their timeless subject a modern feel. These are just a few of the dozens of murals and sculptures that are today being newly appreciated for their intriguing mixtures of tradition and innovation. Some of the Depression-era murals were more modernistic than others, and some sparked even more controversy than Grant Wood's presumed modernism. One group that drew public ire in several art projects grew out of the Iowa PWAP, and when several of its artists joined together with others to form an association called the Cooperative Mural Painter, things really got interesting. The leader of the group, Francis Robert White, also known as Bob White, was a member of the National Executive Committee of the anti-fascist organization called the American Artists Congress. And his presentation at the first national meeting in 1936 was entitled Revolt in the Country, which was a direct reference to Grant Wood's regionalist manifesto of the previous year, Revolt from the City. Instead of extolling the merits of Wood's ideas, however, White argued for greater artistic freedom that the cooperative mural painters could offer to modern America. When he was appointed to head Iowa's division of the FAP, the Fine Arts Project, which was the biggest art project that succeeded the PWAP, a Des Moines headline announced, "Left-winger at the top, White heads Iowa art." White and his collective mural painters received a significant mural commission soon afterwards, a massive project to paint the courtroom of the Lynn County Courthouse, which is now the Cedar Rapids City Hall. And they dramatically moved away from Wood's style, even as they retained some of the agricultural themes of regionalism within its panels. Entitled Law and Culture, with subtitles for each wall, the work is an array of subjects painted by White, Don Glassell, Howard Johnson, Harry Donald Jones, and Everett Jeffrey, all executed in a distinctly more modern style than that of the Iowa State Library's PWAP murals from just 2 years earlier. Both in style and some of the subjects of the Cedar Rapids work, especially the scene, here we go, of lynching, were highly controversial. And as a result, the work was painted over in 1964, although it has been restored quite recently. In another controversial work from this period, Howard Johnson and Daniel Rhoads collaborated on an enormous mural for the Iowa State Fair Agricultural Building in 1937, representing Iowa farmers in ways that some objected to as too modern. The painting was destroyed in 1946, sawn up for scrap lumber, and it is today known only from dim and incomplete photographs. And I couldn't find any of them except in such terrible form that I couldn't even show them. Another work that received scathing reviews for its modernity was the mural entitled A Social History of Des Moines for the Des Moines Public Library, created with federal support between 1937 and 41 by Harry Donald Jones and several assistants. Beginning with the origin of the universe, which we see in the upper right, and moving on to contemporary times, the work included an array of scenes that some viewers, in fact probably many, found disturbing, especially since the context for this work was the children's room of the library. Calls for the painting to be covered up continued for years, primarily led by Alice Cummings, who was the widow of Charles Cummings, who had been the director of the very traditionally oriented Cummings School of Art in Des Moines. As she wrote in 1951, "Removing these paintings will certainly provide a gleam of light in the confused minds of people who are struggling to see into the dark abyss of modernistic or contemporary art as it is foisted upon us." Ultimately, the Social History of Des Moines murals were preserved, and today they are the centerpiece of the World Food Prize Hall of Laureates, which now occupies the former library building. Although Grant Wood and his regionalist style had been criticized in the mid-1930s as too modern by some and not modern enough by others, none of those critiques compared to the vehement disputes that he faced in his own department at the University of Iowa in the late 1930s and early 1940s, which cast him, his work, and that of regionalism more generally as both anti-modern and politically reactionary. Oops, guess you can ignore that. The department's shift from the traditional approach of Charles Cumming, who had taught there for many years in addition to teaching in Des Moines, this approach had dominated until 1935, shifting to an aggressively avant-garde modernistic one after 36. It was due to the arrival of Dr. Lester Longman, a Princeton-educated art historian with a specialty in medieval art and modern criticism, who was intent on refashioning the University of Iowa's program through his own vision of progressive art education. Longman's preference for what he called internationalist modernism was inherently antagonistic to regionalism. Wood's celebration of local culture was abhorrent to this refined scholar, whose notion of cultivation had nothing to do with the soil. And Longman, in turn, personified the aesthete bohemianism that Wood had despised. Tensions between the two men quickly developed into a zealous personal antipathy that escalated toward the end of the decade. Wood's fame only intensified the problem. Longman resented his colleague's national stature and was rankled by his university's close association with regionalism and what he regarded as its provincial focus. Regionalism and its celebration of Midwestern life not only went against his own tastes and ambitions for his art department and American art more generally, but also surely played into his own insecurities for having landed in what he thought of as the hinterlands of Iowa after a promising early career in prestigious Eastern universities. Wood's election to the National Academy of Design in 1935 and the several honorary doctorates he received in 1936 and 37 didn't help. Longman would have preferred to dismiss the artist in overalls as a rube, lacking in academic credibility. And it must have been especially galling to the chairman when Life magazine spotlighted the university art program in 1939 with a full 2-page spread giving Grant Wood pride of place with 2 photographs and no mention of Longman at all. In response, Longman began a concerted campaign to marginalize and discredit Wood, efforts that expanded beyond the university and which ultimately contributed to regionalism's being ignored in the history of modern art for decades. He worked on many fronts, but as editor of Parnassus, which was the College Art Association's flagship journal of art criticism, Longman had a national platform. He used it with vehemence in a series of hyperbolic editorials, the first entitled Better American Art, which was an unrestrained attack on populist imagery, although he never named Grant Wood. Warning of danger ahead, Longman called for the defenders of true art to attack all of what he called reactionary work that he derisively described as sentimental, popular, photographic, propagandistic drivel, glorifying sunsets, forests, naked Aryans, big families, popular heroes, and homely scenes. He went on to say, some people have been calling such art genuinely American as opposed to international, especially if the subject matter is clearly American. The fact is that this style, or lack of style, appears in any country where people know little about aesthetic value. Today, it is typically the communazi fashion. If such reactionary art was not rejected and recognized, Longman prophesied, it could only result in what he called a fascist revolution by illustration mongers who serve us for money and fame, blood brothers of the new order that is so convenient to their material prosperity. The inflammatory rhetoric is startling, but this was, after all, when Hitler and Mussolini were changing the face of Europe in alarming ways, and Stalin's Soviet Union seemed equally ominous. The political dimensions of art were omnipresent in the United States as well, and the New Deal programs were making headlines every day. Art was clearly an effective tool in the ongoing struggles and competing agendas of democracy, communism, and fascism. That said, however, Longman's language remains astonishing. Longman's campaign was unrelenting, even after Wood's untimely death from pancreatic cancer in February of 1942. And there is much more to the story that I could tell you. The file in the university archives is like this thick. It goes on and on and on with the two sides, Grant Wood and Longman, battling through the deans with lots and lots and lots of issues. There was some really nasty stuff going on, particularly to discredit Wood. The most notable aspect was the subtle implication, which was mentioned in a few meetings, but there's only one mention of it in minutes, was that Grant Wood was homosexual. And this was really the ultimate weapon that Longman could use, because at that point, it was a criminal activity. He could have been fired, he could have been discredited completely, and he could have even been thrown in prison. That never came out at the time, but it was part of the process. So just after Longman died, Wood died, Longman did not give up, even though his foe was departed. Just weeks after Wood's death in early April, the chairman circulated an essay about regionalism that he had written for an art dictionary, saying to the University of Iowa officials to whom he sent it, this is a quote, "I believe enough time has passed now, although around here the case may seem otherwise, so that one can analyze the meaning of the term regionalism without it seeming to be more a critical evaluation than a pure analysis." Calling regionalism a minor American movement of inferior but successful artists, Longman did use critical terms, likening its practitioners to Nazi artists, describing them as cultural fascists, and escapist and isolationist and Americanist. Although the essay was purportedly written about the movement as a whole, Wood was clearly the subject. Many specifics unique to him were included, including the artist's preference for wearing overalls when painting and teaching, and phrases that he had used, such as return from Bohemia, and the only good ideas he ever had came from when he was milking a cow. The university administrators were alarmed by the essay's argumentative and biased tone. After being admonished that perhaps the head of the art department, where Grant Wood worked during the last years of his life, should not undertake to define him and his work out of respectful consideration on the part of those who are inclined to be respectful towards him, Longman did not publish the article. But he did go on to write others that damned regionalism and celebrated the international modernism he preferred. Here is that statement. One of these included a remarkable genealogical chart of modern art in the manner of one that the Museum of Modern Art's director Alfred Barr had created to explain the origins of Cubism. Longman's chart was far more damning, since it cast American scene painting and all of its variations into the same family as Nazi art. And there you see the detail with regionalism, isolationism, tribalistic, chauvinistic illustration, as in Benton, Curry, and Wood. Longman was not the only one to create such charts, these sorts of family trees. Ad Reinhardt did another one just 2 years later, which renders a whole host of representational art as weighing down the main branch of the tree to the point of breaking. And below, maybe you can see in the detail, is a graveyard with the folksy scarecrow and the tombstones of many, including Wood, Benton, and Curry, all depicted as ears of corn. Obviously, Longman had allies at the university and throughout the United States, all of whom relished the demise of regionalism. Among the most significant of these was the art historian Horst Janssen, who taught at the University of Iowa from 1939 to 41. And Longman's interests and ideas seem to have had a significant influence on this young scholar. He went on to write several important articles that characterized Wood and regionalism as fascist, But even more significantly, he institutionalized a negative view of the movement through his survey textbook, History of Art, which has sold millions of copies and remains in print today. Not surprisingly, Grant Wood is not mentioned in the text or not in the original edition, and regionalism received one scant and rather negative paragraph that was finally revised in 2006, long after Janssen's death. It was in print with that original form for 40 years and widely used. Lester Longman stacked his faculty with modernists, including Fletcher Martin, Emile Ganso, Philip Guston, who was an emerging figure in the New York School of Abstraction, who had been a high school classmate and friend of Jackson Pollock's, along with Mauricio Lisansky, an Argentinian Guggenheim fellow who had been in Stanley Hayter's Atelier 17. This is a very progressive printmaking workshop in New York. And Lisansky went on to take the University of Iowa's printmaking to international prominence. All of these individuals and many others during and after World War II made major contributions to the development of the University of Iowa's reputation, moving it away from its former association with regionalism and toward a new reputation as a center for contemporary art. A key component of this new era was the exhibition and collecting of modern art. Even though the University of Iowa's museum was not established until 1969, exhibitions had become regular events at the Iowa Memorial Union and the new art building by the mid-1930s. To celebrate the dedication of the new art building shortly after his arrival at the university, for example, Longman wrote to several major museum directors, including Alfred Barr of New York's Museum of Modern Art, asking for a loan exhibition of what he called masters of the past and history-making painters of today. And he continued to arrange for such shows throughout his tenure at the university, increasingly emphasizing the contemporary avant-garde. Many of the exhibitions were borrowed from the most progressive New York and Chicago dealers and galleries, often showcasing works by artists, though not well known at the time, have become canonical to modern art. Le Corbusier, Max Beckmann, Alexander Archipenko were each the focus of special exhibitions on campus in the late 1930s. The exhibition changed as often as once a month. I was absolutely astonished at how many shows were circulated. Any museum today that changed shows that often would go completely crazy. Several different groupings were usually on view at the same time. The program was extremely ambitious, even by today's museum standards, but in the 1930s and 1940s, in a relatively small Midwestern community with no established museum, the array of notable contemporary art that was brought to campus was nothing short of extraordinary. Special contemporary exhibitions were held every summer until at least 1963, sometimes consisting of over 150 paintings, and that's a big show. And divided between galleries at the Art Building and the Union, the shows were extremely provocative. University administrators struggled with the bewildered and often negative public reaction. As one acknowledged to a Des Moines Register reporter, not more than one or two of them in the 1946 exhibition are pretty in the conventional sense. If they were, they would have very little significance for the modern day, for being pretty simply means being conventional, something to which the people are accustomed. But he hastened to add, the implication that these pictures are frightening can just not be taken seriously. Time magazine reported about the same show, quote, some Iowans liked what they saw. Others sent letters of protest to the show's director, Lester D. Longman, who is trying to convince his fellow Iowans that there is more to art than Grant Wood ever dreamed of. When the editor of the Indianola Record Herald and Tribune wrote, and this is a quote, such paintings could only come from the mentally unbalanced, Longman retorted, the present exhibition is too conservative. One might reasonably conclude that the world has gone crazy. This is also the impression we get from your newspaper. So the artists themselves are barometric. not crazy. Iowans were hardly alone in their bewilderment, of course, as this photograph of the Iowa artist Harry Donald Jones demonstrates. Taking one of his paintings to Hollywood in the early 1950s, he was photographed with the actress Jean Peters, who looks bemused at the comparison of the corkscrew and its modernist interpretation. From the outset of the summer shows of modern art at the University of Iowa in the 1940s, Lester Longman envisioned buying contemporary abstract works from the exhibitions for the university's collection. And he was careful to use privately donated funds amounting to about $5,000 annually rather than tax dollars. He also wrote to artists, many of which are now well-known names in modern art, such as Herbert Ferber, Seymour Lipton, David Hare, Max Beckmann, inviting them to serve on the selection committees for the exhibitions and requesting statements about their work to help university administrators appreciate their involvement. There's actually a really rich file of letters from artist after artist, many of whom, if you know anything about modern art, you go, oh my God, he was writing to him? This got the attention of the national press. I've already mentioned Time magazine. The New York papers came to Iowa City to see what all this was about. And Emily Genauer of the New York World Telegraph wrote, "Out in the Corn Belt, it seems they're buying caviar," or its counterpart in Living American Art. The State University of Iowa has just purchased from its first summer exhibition 5 of the handsomest, most sophisticated pictures you could find in a season of gallery going. Among them are a Bradley Walker Tomlin abstraction, an aquatint by the surrealist Andrew Ratz, James Lachey's subtle still life, Room Number 5, and a brilliantly textured, opulently covered Carl Zerba street scene. This in territory hither known counted sacred to the memory of the professional provincial Grant Wood. Genauer was a lifelong champion of contemporary art and was obviously impressed with what was going on out here. Adding to what was already becoming an impressive collection of modern art, the University of Iowa also received some significant gifts during this period. As the modernist collector Peggy Guggenheim closed her innovative Art of this Century gallery in New York in 1947, she gave several groups of works to the university, culminating, of course, as many of you know, here's a few of them, but culminating in Jackson Pollock's massive mural, a work that is now regarded as not only the most valuable work in the university's collection, but a pivotal masterpiece in the artist's career. Pollock had already been featured in a major article in Life magazine over the headline, "Is Jackson Pollock the greatest living painter in the United States?" Modernism in Iowa has many forms, and there's not time to address today a lot of other aspects that reveal, as I hope I have begun to suggest, how important this state's artists have been to contributing to the development of our understanding of contemporary culture. I could have, for example, discussed how the new medium of radio was used to encourage people's interest in art in the 1930s, including interviews with Thomas Hart Benton and Grant Wood. They had a whole series of programs on the radio about art, and people could order in advance prints to look at, which would be discussed like an art history class as they looked at them. Really interesting new educational mode. Or I could have talked more about how Wood's work was featured in glass, along with designs by Georgia O'Keeffe and Henri Matisse and others for the Steuben Glass Company in 1940. And I have not even begun to address artists who left Iowa to do important modernist work, such as Carl Van Vechten from Cedar Rapids, who went on to become one of the most important photographers of the 20th century, making portraits of virtually all of the major figures of the Harlem Renaissance in New York, along with countless writers, actors, and other shapers of culture, including Gertrude Stein, who appreciated him so much that she appointed him executor of her estate. Many of the artists in this exhibition went on to develop more modernistic imagery than we see here after 1950, when this exhibition ends. And certainly all of these works are important to the story of modernism in Iowa, as are the artists who continue making art today in our universities and private studios. As Iowa and Iowa art continues to strive for a balance between progress and its historical identity, the contested period of the 20th century, when modernism was on the ascendant, seems more relevant and important than ever. Thank you. There might be a little time for a question or two, if anybody has one. Yes?
Did you have any comments on why Marvin came to Iowa in the first place? Did he have a specific agenda or did that develop that?
It was 1936. He needed a job. And it was arranged through his connections at Harvard and Princeton, through the Carnegie Foundation. He had been a Carnegie Fellow, and the University of Iowa had a lot of connections with the Carnegie Foundation at the time. They actually helped fund the new art building. And so the boys got on the phone and said, "Who do you recommend?" And Longman was the answer. Yes?
Leon Zeman, he's not up there.
Yeah.
Leon Zeman was part of Grant's colony,
Yes.
and in the early 30s, he came to the tribe,
Oh, really?
painted a bunch of portraits,
Oh, I didn't know that.
and I saw it in an old newspaper, 1930s.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. Portraits of people in the community.
And
Oh, wonderful. So do you know what's happened to those portraits?
then, about 10 years ago, I got a letter from his daughter
Uh-huh,
saying I have this picture that my father painted
uh-huh,
when he was at the settlement.
right?
It's a picture of one of our ladies,
Uh-huh.
and he said, I'm old, I just want to give this to
She was ready to give it to you and did?
we have it, and
Oh.
looking for him in that group picture.
Ah, right. Well, there's a wonderful website on the Stone City Colony that names all of the artists, and you can click on their names and read biographies about them. If you just Google Stone City Art Colony, it's Mount Mercy College that put that together.
As far as I know, that's the only surviving picture of that.
Oh, wow, interesting. It'd be neat to, I don't know, in Britain they have this wonderful website called Your Paintings, and it's a national database, essentially, of private collections as well as public collections, and we could use something like that so that people could post family, pictures, and people like us who research them could find where they are and write about them. Maybe we should have a collaborative project on that. Yes?
I had a question about the younger artists who started to move away stylistically. Was that something that he, was there any kind of public discussion of that or anything that you found that he was hurt by that? Or, obviously Longman and he had this
Right.
battle,
But before that, right. Yeah, Leah could probably tell us. I get all my information from Leah on this. So yes, there was a letter that this cooperative mural painters group sent to Washington, essentially applying as a new group for commissions. And they immediately sent it right back to Grant Wood and said, "What do you know about this?" And that was the first he'd heard of it, and he was very upset and resigned immediately, would have nothing more to do with any of the federal projects. He was very, very upset about it because he felt it being essentially a betrayal of what he had felt really was very much a communal, cooperative, well-working group, and to find out that they were disgruntled was really upsetting to him. Your perspective on the disgruntlement, Leah, was also that mainly he wasn't so much dictatorial, but he had actually arranged for that PWA commission, if I'm not mistaken, before it was ever funded. And so it was his project, but then he shared it with the group, but then they resented having to work in his style. So it was a lot of misunderstanding all along the way. believe you had something.
I do, because I want to thank you for mentioning that even though much of the art that we see in Iowa and in this exhibition does not appear on the surface to be modern, but artists in Iowa were actually, many of them, remarkably aware of modernism. And there's somebody in the exhibition that I want to thank you for mentioning to me, Drew Lowe, and she's a good example.
She is.
Somebody who wasn't aggressive, perhaps, and obvious in her modernism, but it was a foundation
Right.
of her work, and I haven't really been able to address that.
And she went on to do lots of modernist work. Well, we pre-planned this question so that she could get me to show you some of her work, because this is a remarkable collection that I think all Iowans need to know more about, and we're working hard to make that possible. But Drew Lowe, I will make this brief, but here are two self-portraits, one early, one late, was really quite a remarkable Iowan who really didn't spend much of her career in Iowa, but she did leave her mark here in a couple of ways. One is she got a BA in art in the art department at the University of Iowa in 1923, but then she wanted a master's degree. She wanted a professional degree, and they didn't have one. And so she marched herself up to Dean Seashore's office and said, "You need to create a master's degree in art for me." And he did. And part of the innovation of it was not simply they created the degree, but they accepted studio work as part of the thesis. And this was really revolutionary. And we do think she was the first one in the country to get this degree. And the University of Iowa then was the first to grant degrees with studio work as the thesis. And it paved the way for what is now completely accepted practice everywhere. So it's due to her. And she married rather quickly and moved off to Colorado, where her husband became first a faculty member and then a dean at the University of Colorado. And they never had any children, and she continued to paint. She was determined, especially because people told her, "Oh, when you get married, you won't be an artist anymore." And she said, "I'll show you." And she did. She painted and worked in multimedia. And long story short, when she died in the late 1980s, she gave the University of Iowa virtually everything she had not sold, which is a lot of work. We have over nearly 1,000 paintings. We have hundreds and hundreds of drawings, sculptures, prints, preparatory studies, carved furniture, then all of her papers, photographs, documents. It is a dream collection because it's all together. And it is so varied. You can see she changed essentially with the decades, with the au courant styles. She became a regionalist, and then she became an early abstract expressionist, and then she became an op artist, and then she became a sort of pop artist and did landscapes. And she and her husband went around the world twice, and she did work from all over the world. They met Gandhi. She has all kinds of work this is pen and ink, but she did prints and paintings of these subjects as well. Her landscapes are really spectacular, very modernistic and swirling and very colorful. Her abstractions are really quite an array of shapes, styles, colorations, patterns, and textures. It's a remarkable collection. And thank you for the question so I could tell people about this. She didn't quite fit into my narrative any other way. So, but we have all of her work digitized. You can find it on the Iowa Digital Library. If you just Google that, go to Art or Drew Lowe, and you'll find all of this. We're working soon to start putting some shows together. And there is a book. If anybody wants a book, email me. Any more questions? Thank you so much.